This is critical thinking in the reproductive system lab, and here are the questions. Here is the first one, the second one, and here is the third one. Now let's look at the question. So let's look at this first one, where it asks you about increase in blood levels of which substance could indicate cancer of organ A and what passes through B. So before we look at the answers, let's first identify what A and B are and some of the neighboring structures. So as you see here, A represents the prostate gland, and B is the ejaculatory duct which passes through this prostate gland. So this is the duct which passes through the prostate gland. Here we have the vas deferens or the ductus deferens. This here is the seminal vesicle, and you can see the two of them joined together to form the ejaculatory duct. So now it says increase in blood levels of which substance could indicate cancer of organ A, which is the prostate gland. So let's look at the choices. The first one is fructose, which is wrong because fructose is a nutritive substance which is present in the seminal fluid which is secreted by the seminal vesicles, and it provides nutrition for the sperms. In fact, that's the importance of the secretions provided by the seminal vesicle. So the first part of the statement is wrong. And the second part, which says that what passes through B is seminal fluid from the prostate and seminal vesicles, this also is wrong because this ejaculatory duct, and if I was to erase all this ejaculatory duct will carry secretions which come via the vas deferens and which come from the seminal vesicle. So from the vas deferens would be the sperm, and from the seminal vesicle would be the fluid secreted by the seminal vesicle. The prostate gland, which is mentioned here, pours its secretions directly into the prostatic urethra, which is where the seminal vesicle opens. So therefore, this statement is wrong. Let's look at the next statement, which says PSA, or which stands for prostate specific antigen. This is true. Increase in blood levels of PSA do indicate cancer of organ A. And passing into ejaculatory duct are sperm and seminal fluid from the seminal vesicle. So this is the answer to this question. But let's look at number 3, which says inhibin. Inhibin is a substance which is produced by the Sertoli cells in the testes. And of course, ejaculatory duct does not transmit urine. Urine does not pass through the duct. Urine passes in the urethra. So therefore, the correct answer to this question is the second statement. Let's look at the next question, which tells you that while looking at this image over here, which of the statements best describes the effect of progesterone on the uterus? Now let's look at this image. So the first part of this image, which is here, shows you pituitary hormones, the hormones from the anterior pituitary. So these are pituitary hormones which then act on the ovary. So this part is the ovary. So we have the pituitary acting on the ovary. So we can see the two hormones FSH and LH act on the ovary. The ovary then produces two hormones, estrogen and progesterone. These then act on the uterus and they affect the uterine cycle. So let's look at some of the cycles which we see here. So the ovarian cycle consists of a follicular phase, then we have ovulation, and then we have luteal phase. So these are the three phases present in the ovarian cycle. In the follicular phase, estrogen is produced, and in the luteal phase, mainly progesterone and a little bit of estrogen. These then act on the uterine cycle, and the parts of the uterine cycle are the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and the secretory phase. So here we can see that the ovarian hormones act on the uterine cycle at the different phases. So let's look at the choices that we have here. So the first one says that progesterone acts on the proliferative phase and causes increase in height of the endometrium. So if we look here, This is the proliferative phase, and what is acting on the proliferative phase is estrogen, not progesterone. Notice how progesterone is secreted later from the corpus luteum. So therefore, this answer is wrong. The second one, which says progesterone acts on the luteal phase and causes ovulation, this also is wrong because the luteal phase is a phase of the ovary, and in the luteal phase, progesterone is produced. So it cannot act on its own phase because it's produced in that phase. So what acts on the luteal phase are the hormones which come from the pituitary gland. So therefore, this is wrong. The third statement, which says acts on the secretory phase and causes secretion from glands and increase in endometrial thickness. This is the correct statement. So if you look at, and let me erase this and look here again. So you can see progesterone produced in the ovaries is acting, and if you look directly below, you can see it is acting on the secretory phase. Notice how the endometrial thickness is increasing. So you can see it is going up. And it's known as secretory phase because the glands in the endometrium, you can notice how these glands are getting taller. These glands secrete glycogen, and glycogen is the nutrition for the zygote. Should the ovum be fertilized and then the zygote comes and implants. So it's preparation for implantation. So the effect of progesterone is on the secretory phase, and the effect is to cause secretion from glands and an increase in endometrial thickness. So this is the correct answer. But let's look at the fourth choice also, which says acts on the follicular phase. And again, the follicular phase is a phase of the ovary, of the ovarian cycle. So the hormone firstly cannot act on a phase of the ovarian cycle because it's produced in a phase of the ovarian cycle. So it has to act on something else. And of course, it doesn't cause maturation of the Graafian follicle. What acts on the ovarian cycle is the FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone. That's why it's called the follicular phase, and this is called follicle stimulating hormone, and that's what causes maturation of the Graafian follicle. So the answer to this question is the third statement. Let's then look at the last question, where it asks you to identify the muscle layer in A, and then what does B lie between. So let's first get our bearings right in this image. So you can see that this is a sagittal section. It's a sagittal section of a female pelvis, because here you can see this is the symphysis pubis. This part here is the sacrum. And if we go from anterior to posterior, we can see this is the bladder and this is the urethra. Here we have the uterus and the vagina, and here this is the rectum. So we have the bladder with the urethra here, the uterus with the vagina in between, and then the rectum posteriorly. So having identified this, let's see what it asks for. So it asks you for what the muscle of the bladder is called, since it's pointing to A. And the second part of the question is this pouch that is present. You can see the space, which is a peritoneal pouch, and it's asking you what that lies between. So we can see this pouch here, this peritoneal pouch. So let's look at the choices. The first one says myometrium, which is wrong because myometrium is the muscle of the uterus, whereas this is pointing to the bladder. And the second part of the statement, which is what does B lie between, it says posterior vaginal wall and cervix. What lies between the posterior vaginal wall and cervix is something known as the posterior fornix. And very often students make a mistake between the fornix and the pouch of peritoneum. And if you look here, this is the posterior fornix, which is lying between this posterior vaginal wall here and the cervix here. So I'll put that in a different color. So you can see that this area here is the posterior fornix, which is lying between this posterior vaginal wall and the cervix here. But the arrow is not pointing to that. The arrow is pointing outside the uterus. So if you were to see it, if this is the uterus and this is the vagina this way, and here is the rectum, and we have the peritoneum, it comes this way and it goes out this way. So this part is where the arrow is pointing, whereas the posterior fornix lies in this area here. So therefore, this second part is also not correct. Let's look at the second statement, which says detrusor. So yes, the muscle of the bladder is called the detrusor, but B, it says here, lies between the vagina and the urethra. Now this is the vagina and this is the urethra, but B is not lying between those two. So this is wrong. So hence this entire statement is wrong. The third says perimetrium. Perimetrium is the outer layer of the uterus, this outermost connective tissue layer of the uterus. The inner layer is called endometrium, the middle or muscle layer is called myometrium, and the outermost is called perimetrium. So the arrow is not pointing to the perimetrium, so this is wrong. And the second part of the statement is also wrong because it's suggesting that this is lying between the rectum and sacrum, which means posterior to the rectum. Between the rectum and the sacrum means this area, but that's not where the arrow is lying. The arrow is anterior to the rectum. It's lying between the rectum and the uterus. So let's look at the last statement, which says the muscle layer is called detrusor, which is true. The muscle of the bladder is called detrusor, and the arrow is lying between the rectum and the uterus because it is the pouch of Douglas, or also known as the recto-uterine pouch. So therefore, the answer to this question is this one.